I'll be hosting the session for tonight. This session is organized and hosted by Isaka and sponsored by Noria. Let's go over again through the house rules. Please mute your microphone as soon as you join and stop sharing your video. So please disconnect your camera as well so that we can all focus on our speaker for this evening. And if you can, correct, or at least when you add your name, to put it clearly with the first name, last name, so that you can get the CPE, the well-deserved CPE for attending. This presentation will be recorded, and the slides will be shared after the session. Our speaker for this evening would prefer the questions to be asked at the end. I think that 1902. I think we could get started. Yes, it's very strict. But if you have any questions about the terms being used or any immediate question that you would like answered, please raise your hand. Otherwise, please ask your questions on the chat. If you can ideally indicate hashtag question so that we can pinpoint the questions in the middle of comments, that would be much appreciated as well. And without further ado, I want to introduce you to Anthony Hibbett, and he'll introduce himself. And thank you, Anthony, for joining us this evening. Over to you.
Thank you, Daniela, and thank you to the team, and thanks for this opportunity. Yes, if I may introduce myself, I'm an AI responsible AI expert, currently doing independent consulting. I've been supporting the ING AI department over the last 5 years, keeping them out of trouble. So if you haven't seen the AI department in the newspapers recently, then I think we've done a good job together. My background is both data protection law, cybersecurity. I've been a CISO as well as a global DPO as well. And I really like where it all comes together, and hopefully I'll give you a bit of a flavor of where it all comes together today. So let's get started. Here we go. So I'd like to share with you today my perspective on the overlooked compliance challenges of large language models, and specifically the personal data that is encaptured, that is inside these models, and then what are the implications of the fact that the personal data is in there under the GDPR. So what does it mean in compliance terms? So by way of foundation or getting back to basics here, what we're talking about, large language models. We're talking about your ChatGPT and other popular models, which are very good at working with language, multiple languages. And of course, they are trained on huge amounts of data, typically off the internet, but not necessarily so. They can be also private data sets containing text, web data, books, images converted to text, structural data, and so on. Now, of course, the power of these large language models, such as ChatGPT, is their adaptation, in that once you have that basic competency of language, then you can use it for question and answering, you can use it for sentiment analysis, information summarization, planning, and so on. There's a lot of exploration, of course, going on about how to use large language models in various organizations and in many use cases and settings. Sorry,
Anthony, for interrupting. Can you please press F11? Because we're still seeing the screen. Thank you.
There we go. Thanks for the reminder. So if we look at the training of large language models, well, you've got the traditional training of AI systems on the left, where you basically take the data, you do some cleaning and processing, to get your training data, you isolate the features that you want, and then you train your model, and that trained model then takes input and then makes predictions. And it's roughly the case with large language models, except in the diagram on the right, you can see that there are some other stages typically involved in the training. That is to say, there's a pre-training, which has the most of the computation and the data all thrown at the model for the learning. You've got instruction and fine-tuning, and as the second step, and then there may be some reinforcement learning from human feedback so that it is even further fine-tuned, although it's a different methodology typically, so that it serves its purpose. Now, the thing about large language models is it's quite clear, there's been research papers on this, that large language models such as ChatGPT memorize data, memorize long streams of text, including personal data. And here's an actual extract, a real extract, where you can see it's not roughly, it's verbatim text. One of the major teachers of the arm-powered golf swing, it's memorization. And there we've got the black text, as we don't want to share that personal data in this call. You've got the contact details of a certain Rose person, probably phone number, email address, and so on. So it's quite clear that researchers have been able to extract this kind of information one way or another, and we'll get to some of those methods in brief, but they are able to extract that personal data. And it's verbatim. It's really some memorization going on there. Well, what are the dimensions of this, or what are the factors? When does it happen? When do you get more memorization, less memorization, and so on? Well, first of all, as the large language models increase in size, their tendency to memorize, including personal data, increases. So the larger the model, the more memorization, the more likely you are to find personal data in there. It's not going up quite as fast as the size of the model, but given how fast the size of the model is going up, it's still increasing quite well. Memorization is influenced by the diversity of the training data. So this means if those models are being trained on the same text repeatedly, because that's the text that appears multiple times in your training set on the internet, then it's more likely to be memorized, as you would kind of expect. More context aids the extraction. So this means the more information you include in your prompt, the easier it is to get the personal data out of that memorized data out. And data exposed later to the model is more likely to be memorized rather than generalized. So this means that if you're doing those fine-tuning steps, you're doing those those fine-tuning steps either as a provider of the model or as a deployer of the model, which is possible, we'll get to, then it's more likely to be memorized. If that data is exposed to the model at a late stage, then it doesn't have a chance to generalize. Now, when I first looked at this, I thought, well, okay, this is a factor. This is simply because the large language models are failing to generalize. But as we'll see, it's not. It's rather a design feature. This is something that is really a key feature of large language models. Because if you've got a model which can memorize, you've got a model which has accurate answers, you have facts, which you can query those facts, and you can get quotes out and all sorts of other things which rely on precise text. Now, of course, the disadvantage of memorization is that there is the potential for breaches of privacy and for breaches of intellectual property. I mean, you only have to look at the New York Times case at the moment, which is going on, that the fear is that the intellectual property of the New York Times has been taken and can be accessed through ChatGPT. We're going to concentrate today on the breaches of privacy. So as I mentioned, it's possible that it's more likely to have memorization at later stages, and those later stages, the fine-tuning, the employing RAG, which we'll come to, and the custom instructions and cross-session memorization. So these are all activities that a deploying organization can do. So take on the model like ChatGPT and customize it yourself. So just to make sure what we're talking about with the fine-tuning of models, you've got your pre-training of your model, which is very computationally demanding, billions of parameters, and I think we're even up to trillions. And then it can be fine-tuned within another organization to the exact use case and purposes. Now, there is this other concept of retrieval augmented generation, and it kind of works like this. And you're actually probably familiar with this. If you've uploaded a document to ChatGPT, then this is what you're essentially doing. You're sharing a document. This document becomes an embedding, so it gets transformed into a certain vector space. It's captured into a database, and that is actually added to your prompt. So it's not added to the LLM, but rather the prompt gets massively bigger, and you give your prompt to that large language model, and you get your result. So again, it's not adding to the model itself, but this information, of course, is available at least in the session. And if you look at these concepts, these features of custom instructions and cross-session memorization, this is also what is happening. Your data, and if you include personal data, is becoming part of the custom instructions and handled in the same way. OpenAI hasn't given too many clues, but my guess is that this is what's happening with cross-session memorization, which is in beta, I believe, at the moment. So this means that if I add my name and my birth date, ChatGPT can memorize it from one day to the next, from one chat session to the next. So it's a different way of adding information. And although it doesn't get added to the model, it's still important from a personal data and GDPR perspective. So I want to also come to a couple of basics, foundational things for working with GDPR, because the GDPR is concerned with the processing of personal data. So let's take the processing. Well, there's at least 3 phases of processing that you can look at. The collection of training data. So that's collecting the data from the internet or from a private repository or database. And of course, this is problematic, particularly with regard to consent and so on. But it also includes the collection of operational data. Then the second major processing step is the training of the large language model using the training data. And this includes the fine-tuning steps that we've encountered before. Then the last step is the operation of the large language model using operational data, and this includes the RAG information, those documents being added. Now, again, we're going to focus a little bit more, we're funneling down on the training and the operational processing. The collection is problematic. That's for another day. Then we're looking at the data and the personal data.
I'm sorry, can you please make sure that you're muted? Thank you.
So we're talking about the personal data here. So it's processing of personal data, and there can be at least 3 ways of manifesting personal data in a model or in the training data itself. So in the training data, you can have personal data, that's really the essence of me, my name, address, and so on. Then you can have data associated with an individual. This is a little bit more of a spectrum. Further on the spectrum away, this could be my salary, for example. And then you have information about an individual which can be inferred. Now, a good example of this is if somebody writes on social media that, no, I'm expecting the kids to come on Monday, as they usually do. Not this week, but next week. Then you could infer from that this is this text indicates that the person is divorced, because this tends to be what happens in joint custody situations. You have the kids for a certain number of days and not the other day. So this kind of information, info about an individual which can be inferred. Now, all of these types of personal data can be in the training data, they can be in the large language model itself, and they can be in the RAG-related data that we've seen. So those documents that you add to essentially to the prompt. Now, there are known attacks on large language models, prompt injection attacks, model extraction attacks, where you take the whole model, reconstruction attacks, where you essentially be able to copy the model, membership inference, and property inference attacks. So these have been known for quite some time, have real world possibilities. So it is possible to get the data and the model itself using one of these techniques. I won't go into them in detail, but they're definitely well-established techniques that you'll find in the OWASP top 10 for generative AI, for example. So if we turn now to the GDPR compliance and personal data in LLMs. Now, I'm going to start with anonymization. And why anonymization? Well, it helps us to answer the questions about how to treat this memorization issue in large language models under the GDPR. So with anonymization, there is recital 26, and it says that the principles of data protection should not apply to anonymous information. So if you've really anonymized your personal data, it's no longer applicable to GDPR. It's not personal data in essence. And to determine whether a natural person is still identifiable, account should be taken of all the means reasonably likely to be used, such as singling out either by the controller or another person to identify that individual. So that's what recital 26 is all about. Now, there is a risk-based approach to re-identification, which is emerging in the EU. And that's emerging for a couple of reasons. There's a couple of cases on it, and the Data Act suggests that this is the direction that we're heading in. So what this means is what we're looking at least for anonymization, is the feasibility of re-identification, taking into account factors and the risk of re-identification. It's not absolute. Now, there has been an approach, there has been guidance which has suggested that anonymization has to be absolute. And if this was the case, then this would also apply to large language models in that sense. So if we're wrong and it's not going to be a risk-based approach, then we hit the same kind of issues and even more in a more extreme way. At least with a risk-based approach, there is the possibility of taking some measures, taking some action. So what I'm saying is that the anonymization guidelines, which were written by the Article 29 Working Party back in 2014, that these legal guidelines can be applied to the re-identification of personal data in LLMs. So that memorization, we can look at the guidance that was established in 2014 already, because it's applicable. Also, if you want to think why would it be applicable? Well, if you were to really use a large language model to try and anonymize information, then those anonymization guidelines would apply. So there are legal tests and guidelines for isolating individuals, linking records, and inferring information. So these are the three tests, if you like. Is it possible to single out an individual? Is it possible to link records relating to an individual? And is it information concerning an individual? Can that be inferred? And if you've got a yes to any of these questions, then you're able to re-identify. So you have personal data. Other recognised factors under recital 26 are the costs of doing the re-identification, the amount of time required for the identification, and taking into account the available technology and future developments. There is even a catch-all. The guidance suggests that you can take into account all relevant contexts, the nature of the data control, and finally, there's a mention of security here. Security measures, sample size, public information availability, and so on. So it's a comprehensive approach where you can consider common sense factors. So let's start to apply that guidance, those three tests, in the context of large language models and their ability to memorize. So, at least in terms of inherent risks, we see that for test one, as we saw at the start, that verbatim text, well, it's clear that large language models may memorize. It's also clear from the research that large language models are able to associate. They have information in them which is associated with an individual. So that's also been observed in studies. And test 3 also has been observed that you can infer information about individuals from the data which is extractable from large language models, but it's difficult to systematically identify these inferences. Because if you think about it, these pieces of information are quite contextual, and you really need to infer it. You can't just extract it and then say whether you have personal data or not. It requires a bit of a thought around that. Now, there are some considerations in applying the legal tests here. Now, extraction difficulty varies. As I've said before, it's enhanced by data processing. So if you deduplicate the training data, if you don't have multiple copies of the same text, if you apply obfuscation, then you make it more difficult to extract the information. But it is eased by the cheap and unauthorized methods which are possible. And I already jumped to that line in red, and a study showed that just with $200 you could extract comprehensively all the data, personal data, in a model, in a large language model. So it suggests that the costs and the feasibility is quite low, in fact. There are some other considerations that re-identification risk must be considered, not just by the creator of the model, like your open AI, but for those, the deployers, such as organizations that you and I work for. And it is in that context that it has to be looked at. So external extraction. But what this is heading towards is that ultimately organizations must evaluate directly or through their suppliers if a large language model processes personal data, and that personal data is memorized, or you can link to make linkages with an individual or inferences, and the feasibility of that extraction. So if we look at pseudonymization, sorry, I always had trouble with this word and I cannot avoid it during this presentation. So pseudonymization, and if you look at all of those considerations, this is from the guidance, again from 2014. We've already looked at how effective these techniques are, and where the yeses are is actually bad. If you read it carefully, is it still a risk? Yes, it's still a risk. As you get on to some of the techniques, differential privacy, well, they're starting to show some promise, but we see that quite a mixed picture and not entirely conclusive picture coming from the Article 29. Now, along with those limitations in whether these techniques actually do work to prevent extraction and re-identification of the personal data, you've got some other practical issues with personal data is not easily identified in unstructured text data. So performing some of the techniques isn't easy in bulk and on a scale that's probably required here. And again, inference requires additional context to determine if the information should be removed or redacted or otherwise processed so it can't come out the other end. Note that these techniques apply to data. So these techniques you could all do with more or less success on the training data or even the operational data or even your RAG data. But there are similar techniques which can be applied during model learning, and these are adding noise during learning and differential privacy, stochastic gradient descent. And this is all about changing the algorithm so it generalizes more than it currently does. And in this way, you don't memorize. As we mentioned before, one of the factors that does come into play on the feasibility, the risk of re-identification is security, and it comes in two ways. So there are techniques, thank goodness, that can be employed from a security point of view to prevent or minimize the likelihood of an extraction, such as limiting the queries to the model, detecting suspicious queries, monitoring the frequency of the output from a model, or, and these are AI specific, creating more robust architectures to prevent side channel attacks and so on. Of course, I'm not here to say that these are entirely effective, and it's an arms race, as many of you know, here as well as in many other instances of cybersecurity. But there are definitely measures which can help secure your large language model. And you see that there are techniques also in place from ChatGPT. If you try and ask for personal data out of it just in a normal prompt, you're not going to succeed. It's going to say, that's, hey, what are you doing? I'm not going to give you personal data. But of course, we all know that there are ways to jack that in the news these days and have been successfully applied. Now, there is one other aspect where security does come into play, and that is where there has been, for example, obfuscation or tokenization of the training data or the input data. Now, if that process is reversible, You want to make sure that the keys to that, the methodology to that, the instructions that would otherwise reverse the process are kept under lock and key, so that it's not easily for somebody to simply grab those and then reverse the process of obfuscation, tokenization, and so on. But what we end up with is implementing privacy techniques and security measures on both the model and the training data can help to mitigate the risks of re-identification. Now, to kind of summarize and put them all together in a visual way, I always like the visual diagrams. That's how my brain works. If we look at the training data, as we've seen, there's three kinds there: personal data, data associated with an individual, and the inferred information. And as we see, some of the techniques work, or suggestions, strong suggestions that they will work. Aggregation and duplicate removal will help with the first two categories. The inferred information, some of those techniques may work or may not. I think further work in this area is required. We do see that for training data, duplicate removal will help. And of course, if you've got a data set that doesn't have any personal data in it, then that will work too. Of course, if you don't have any personal data in your training set, then you're not going to end up with any kind of memorization of personal data. So that's the easiest one. Model scale may well be a good approach in some circumstances. I was speaking to a colleague at Rabobank, and they were selecting large language models for purely data science reasons, which were not so big, because there's no need to get a model for some use cases which can process Finnish and Japanese and so on. So if you limit it to, a 7 billion parameter kind of model, you will minimize the amount of personal data in there. And of course, if you choose a large language model with no personal data, again, then you've succeeded. And data security, again, putting the defenses around the large language model, ensuring that they are effective, robustness, and so. Sorry, no, I'm jumping ahead. This is data security of just the training data. If you make sure that the techniques you apply to that stop the training data from being reversed after you've carried out some methods, obfuscation, tokenization, and so on, then that will definitely help. Then again, if you look at what you can do, the measures you can take with model learning and the privacy enhancements there, you can add noise, you can apply this technique of the stochastic gradient descent. The context size, if you limit the context size to the model when it's being queried, and model security. So that is making those measures, limiting access to the model, checking the outflows, and so on, as well as the robustness of your model. So in conclusion, measures can be taken to limit the risks of re-identification, and hence, depending on the model and the measurements, may serve to make the risks of re-identification of personal data from LLMs low. It seems also at the moment that security will play more of a role than the privacy enhancing technologies in this, because of the doubts, and also, as we will come to, the fundamental nature, the fundamental key benefit of memorization that large language models have. We'll come to that. But what this means is a comprehensive risk assessment, including the risk of re-identification, seems necessary. Now, if you've got those two combinations, personal data which can be re-identified, and you're processing that personal data, then it comes under the purview of the GDPR, not just the processing of training data or the operational data, but the actual usage of the large language model falls under the GDPR in those circumstances. And then, as I'm sure you're aware, a lot of these are the requirements of the GDPR. They all apply. So you must have a legal basis for that processing. You have to make sure what you're doing is transparent and so on. And for example, that may have the consequence that if you've got a large language model trained in the EU, then there may be difficulties in even transferring that model to another jurisdiction which does not have an adequate level of protection for data subjects. So, and there's of course a lot of consequences of processing personal data. This isn't only a issue for OpenAI, but rather those organizations, of which there are many starting, that are starting with their own implementations and adaptations of large language models. And this can mean that where you have in practice the possibility of re-identification, that the deployer, the organization, becomes a joint data controller. And particularly where that organization is influencing how the model is then being used, and the use of personal data for further training, and of course with the RAG data. Fortunately, joint responsibility does not equate to equal responsibility, but here the GDPR requires that joint controllers transparently define and come to an arrangement. So written down in the contract who's responsible for which obligations under the GDPR. In practice, this is going to be very difficult because of the power imbalance and US dominance and so on. And each controller then also has a duty to ensure that the data is not further processed in a manner incompatible for the purposes for which they originally collected. So if you're doing something with extracting personal data from the model which you've found, then that's definitely non-compliant with the GDPR. Now, with AI models, there's typically, and data science is typically referred to a trade-off between privacy protection and data utility. And you can think about this as the more obscured the information is, the less utility it has in terms of accuracy. So there is a trade-off here. But what we see with large language models is that this seems to be, at least to me, more fundamental. It's not something that large language models, at least as they are designed today, are going to give up easily. So if you look at OpenAI in the context of this New York Times case, it's impossible to create ChatGPT without copyrighted content. You know, they know they're taking copyrighted content because it can be memorized and it can be processed and it can be a useful part of answers. And so really questioning here whether it is possible for large language models to work well without memorization. You know, their power comes from the memorization. If you were to take that away today, they would lose a lot of their functionality. This is rather negative. There may be some hope in terms of future developments in models. There might be a further separation between the model itself and what it memorizes. I've seen some research on that. So this may be a phenomena at this point in terms of the development of AI. Who knows? But to me, it's quite problematic. Okay, I'm just going to finish with a section on Article 4.5 of the GDPR, because it talks about pseudonymization and whether that actually helps here or not. Well, Article 4.5 talks about processing of personal data in such a manner that the personal data can no longer be attributed to a specific data subject without the use of additional information, and provided that such additional information is kept separately and is subject to technical and organizational measures. So if you carry out these obfuscation, for example, and what you do is you keep the original data quite secure, then you may be able to get the benefit of Article 4.5. But and some of the consequences are, for example, in green on the screen, is that the data subject's rectification rights are further limited. So there is some advantage by having the data designated in this way. But the issue is with many large language models, but not necessarily all, is that they're trained on public data. So it's really impossible. You can't just secure the internet and say it can't be used to re-identify the information, re-identify the personal data. And also, if you've gone through this process and you can still re-identify the information, the personal data in any way, then it still doesn't help you. So it still comes back to that kind of practical feasibility, or the risk-based feasibility that we've seen. And then what about these techniques applied to the model training, as we've seen, adding the noise and the stochastic gradient descent and so on. This definition under Article 4.5 there, it doesn't seem to really apply to this kind of situation. It's all about having the original data under lock and key and kept secure. So really, it's a bit of speculation of how it would apply to those techniques. And I think what we're going to see ultimately is some changes in the concept of pseudonymization, because it's very specific to these kind of circumstances, and probably what we need in the future is something a little bit more general, if that's acceptable, and to find the balance of what's reasonable, what is risk-based, taking into account the rights of the data subject. So what do we have here? We have that large language models memorize, and that organizations must evaluate directly or through their suppliers if a large language model processes personal data by memorization, linkage, or inference, and has that information available for re-identification, following a risk-based approach. The approach that I've suggested is applicable here in terms of using first principles. Then if we use those 3 tests and the allowable factors, then large language models do pose a risk of re-identification. And this makes GDPR applicable not only to the processing of the training data, but also to the model itself. That's the important point. Implementing privacy techniques, and in particular security measures on both the model and training data, can mitigate these risks, but they may well, particularly the privacy techniques, may compromise the key functionality of memorization. So I'm not sure whether that is actually practical. And lastly, the Article 4.5, as defined by the GDPR, requires a data separation a criteria not met by public large language models. Though it may be applicable for specific models if you think of models trained, on Bloomberg data or legal text and so on. So potentially easing some GDPR obligations towards data subjects may be less practical than it sounds. Will likely need to be this concept, as I mentioned, will likely need to be reconsidered, I think, and to be made more general and perhaps rethought, particularly in light of these developments in terms of large language models and AI. Okay, then we're open for questions. I will just
thank you so much. You still have
yes.
some content, or
No, I don't. I will just
can you leave your
leave it on
slide?
that slide. Yes.
Yeah, please. We already have some questions, Anthony. Thank you very much for the walkthrough. And personally, I would say that this question raises more questions than answers, right? The more we know, the less we know. I'll start with the questions by order. So we have one of the questions is from Peter. Can you clarify differential privacy and give an example?
Differential privacy is a technique where I think it will take too long to explain in this session. It's readily available that you can look up the technique. I would suggest you do so rather than me fudge my definition of it. But it is a technique which demonstrates that you have done sufficient measures to the data to restrict the privacy in it, and there are different forms of it. So, which is kind of why I don't want to go into it in too much detail today. But have a look at that. It's a very interesting technique. It hasn't got a lot of take up yet, maybe for some of the practical reasons that I mentioned in the presentation.
Thank you, Anthony. Good tip to investigate. Although, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of research onto AI, it's like you should be careful going down the rabbit hole, right? Because it's a never-ending story, and many questions arise from there. Another question is, can pseudonymization in any way negatively impact the correctness of future LLM results?
Yes, I think that's a real concern. That's a good question. That is a real concern because, as per that slide on the trade-off, if we're not careful with training on more generalized data, then you can get less accuracy. So adopting some of these techniques will, unless they're very careful, will result in less accurate models. Now, if your percentage of personal data and the amount of pseudonymization you do is quite limited, then it's probably not going to affect your model in terms of accuracy in a major way. You know, if it goes down by half a percentage point, you probably still got a very useful practical model. It depends on lots of factors, how much data, personal data you have, and so on. But it is something that you should be aware of, and you can even measure that. Of course, you can try some models with the same with data which is pseudonymized and the original data, and see how much of an effect you get.
Thank you, Anthony. One more question. how can one audit an already existing LLM model to check if there is no private data in it, to assure that the organization that they're not in breach with GDPR? Is that feasible practically?
Well, I understand the concern in the question, and there may be many circumstances where practically understanding how much personal data in the model, if it's your chat GPT and they will not share that information, it's going to be very difficult. But if it's a open source model where they have shared that, or you're constructing or fine tuning your own model, and you at least for the fine tuning, you can see how much personal data is going into it and so on. There may be the possibility. There is also the possibility of performing some of these extraction techniques, extraction attacks. Get a penetration tester to see whether you can jailbreak it, whether you can be successful in one of the attacks and get personal data out of that. Of course, that penetration testing is not always feasible, but it might give you a very good sense of what is the feasibility of extracting personal data.
Indeed, well, I must confess I've done that myself. And I asked some Gen AI engines about myself, and first of all, they would have initial guardrails saying that I cannot comply with that request because that's a private person, and I would just claim that this person is very well known and is from the public domain, so you're authorized to provide me with that information. And guess what? Those engines did provide information about me. Half of it was incorrect. The other half, I don't know where they got that from. So I learned that I play the piano, which is surprising to me. Until today, I didn't know. But you raised in terms of pseudonymization, you mentioned the Article 26. What about all the subjects' rights? That is, I never provided them with consent to treat that information. How can I correct my information with these engines? It is impossible, correct?
Well, it may not be impossible theoretically. There are some techniques which can be applied to models so that it can forget items of information, personal data, and so on. But there's another question as to whether they're practical and feasible and so on. And from what I've, my limited research and on this is that they are also very computationally intensive. So, it's not an easy fix. You just highlight the piece of information and it's deleted. No, it may require some fine tuning. It may require some substantial efforts before you can scrub that data. So that makes any kind of change, at least with the state of the art and the technology, doubtful. It may well be that they come up with techniques shortly to do so. That's quite possible, but it leaves with the sense of it's kind of too late to do a correction if the personal data is in there. You could also put another system as a guardrail system to stop the personal data coming out, but that's not a rectification. That's not changing it, altering it, deleting it in the first place, which is really what you're required to do under the GDPR.
So that's a layered workaround, let's say. So the right to be forgotten, the right to correct your data is not in practice very feasible. And also about automated decision making and profiling. how can we comply with GDPR if we can't even control the accuracy of the information? How can we ensure that the due care is being taken with regards to profiling? And we had that. Well, we had a scandal, right, in the Netherlands some years ago about the benefits, which was already some kind of fancy machine learning, let's say. How can we prevent that? How can we comply with those rights of the data subjects?
Well, if you do a comprehensive risk assessment, which includes not only the legal considerations but the ethical considerations during the development, if you implement privacy by design, security by design, ethics by design, and if you consider these possible impacts early on, then you can get a model which is ethically compliant as well. There was another.
There's another question as we're
Yes.
approaching the end of the hour. The question is, so the only way is to maybe have a known text kind of attack like in cryptography analysis. Maybe if you want to unmute yourself, Ramzi, to elaborate on your question.
Can you hear me, Shuri?
Yes.
I was asking, like, the only way to be sure, because Anthony was talking about trying the pen testing technique, but we know that this could fail to show that there is personal information inside, is to maybe inject some made up personal information and try to see at the very far end if you can get it back. Then you know it's a test for memorization. This kind of attack is a known text attack in cryptanalysis when you want to see if the cipher could be reversed or something. So I was asking, is that the only way, or that's even a way known, or there is another way?
Well, this is a good point. This would be a good way to help with the assessment, with the analysis of whether it is feasible to extract the information. So and do that with data which is not real personal data. So it's a kind of hygienic way of doing it, and this would give you a strong indication of whether it's possible to extract personal data or not, but you would still need to look at whether there's actual personal data ending up in there, and not just sort of the kind of fake personal data that you might put in there. But so it might well help with testing your security and your efforts to keep the model secure. I think, in a general sense, we should be, and this is extending the theme of risk-based approach. I think we should be heading for outcomes which are balanced, with respecting the data subject's rights and to rectification and not having their personal data and so on. But we don't need to be extreme and absolute, and the law should, GDPR should, and its application should in the future recognize this, and not go all out and make things, the development of models completely impossible to clean out personal data and so on. I think it has to really go in this direction of risk-based and appropriate balances, and not just theoretical risks to data subjects that may happen with this theoretical attack or this way of re-identification. I think it has to be a little bit more practical.
Daniela, you're on mute.
Oh no, it's since 2020, right? The most common phrase. But thank you, Anthony. Considering the time, Very shortly, if you were given 30 seconds to provide the best advice for security practitioners to safeguard their AI solutions, what would you say?
Well, it would be mostly look at the traditional security that you would apply to any other system. It's access to the system, and look at are you able to be sure that the access and the data output from your model is appropriate. So look at the access control, who has access, and monitor some of the output of that to make sure that it's not being taken over, extracted, copied, and so on. And use use all of the sources available, your OWASP, generative AI top 10, and your AI top 10, and look there. So those would be my tips.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, everyone, for the presentation. I hope that you enjoyed it as much as I did. And just to recap, the recording is being done, but the slides will also be shared, and your CPE will be on your way for those who identified yourselves correctly, or the system is processing. But I'm sure that we can find you. And well, hopefully I'll be able to host future sessions, and hope to see you there. And thank you. Have a nice evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.